This is you. You are one of the 68,000 active military personnel with the Canadian Armed Forces. While you're a member of a unit, an army, and a country, today we want to talk about you. That's right, just you. As a member of the Canadian Armed Forces, you will be faced by physical and mental challenges during your deployment. The mental challenges of your deployment may result in the development of mental health conditions. Today, we will be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It is estimated that 1 in 10 active military personnel from the Canadian Armed Forces suffers from PTSD. As such, this issue is important to your community and warrants discussion. We hope that at the end of this video, you will understand what PTSD is from a biomedical perspective, why you're at a greater risk, and what can be done to prevent PTSD. So, let's get started with the science. What is PTSD, and what does PTSD look like? PTSD is a psychological condition in which cognitive and behavioral changes are initiated following exposure to a traumatic event or stressor. Examples of trauma can include anything from child abuse to sexual assault to engaging in warfare, which is what most directly applies to you. In general, PTSD symptoms are sorted into 3 categories: re-experiencing symptoms such as flashbacks, avoidance and emotional numbing symptoms such as isolation, and hyperarousal symptoms, such as being easily startled. PTSD diagnosis is categorized by the time in which symptoms present themselves, classified into acute, where symptoms last less than 3 months, chronic, where symptoms last more than 3 months, and delayed onset, where the onset of symptoms occurs after 6 months. Experiencing trauma causes certain changes in brain structure and function, which results in the onset of these symptoms. It has been shown that trauma specifically affects the 2 emotional centers of the brain, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system is comprised of the amygdala, which are responsible for detecting fear, and the hippocampi, which regulate memories. The prefrontal cortex is located outside the limbic system and controls emotional processing. Individuals with PTSD have abnormal patterns of brain activity in these important regions. It is commonly misunderstood that PTSD is just a mental disorder, but we stress that it is not only a psychological condition, but also has serious neurobiological effects that physically affect your bodies. As your community is more exposed to trauma, it is more likely that you will develop overactive fear pathways compared to the general population. In general, active military personnel are more likely to experience trauma, such as being attacked, ambushed, seeing human remains, or seeing a comrade killed or injured. These traumas can lead to the symptoms of PTSD mentioned previously. Disruptions in memory and emotional imbalance can be accredited to hypoactivation of the hippocampi and prefrontal cortex. Evidence shows that in individuals with PTSD, the hippocampi and prefrontal cortex decrease in volume as they are understimulated. Additionally, overactive fear pathways exist due to constant hyperarousal, correlated with a hyperactive amygdala. The result is a change of brain structure, specifically in the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. In sum, your community's exposure to trauma in combat zones trigger the biomedical pathways of PTSD. These triggers may manifest into the common symptoms. As such, there is a significant relationship between components of the brain and PTSD symptoms, demonstrating a strong biological etiology or manner of causation that can be coupled with societal factors. As in most diseases and health issues, the prevalence and severity of PTSD not only depends on biological factors, but also on social determinants that may contribute to increasing the risks of developing the disorder. The major social determinants associated with PTSD are working conditions and social exclusion. Traumatic workplace conditions can determine the prevalence and severity of PTSD. Military personnel are more likely to be exposed to psychological trauma than the general public and thus are more likely to develop PTSD. Soldiers in the highest quartile of combat exposure were more than 4.5 times as likely to screen positive for PTSD as those in the lowest quartile. This is because these soldiers experienced more combat trauma, such as being a target of both large and small artillery, as well as being ambushed. Beyond armed forces, other high-stress and traumatic occupations, such as police and emergency service workforces, can increase the risk of developing PTSD. In these populations, the prevalence of PTSD ranges from 6% to 32%. Another social determinant that contributes to PTSD is social exclusion. Most people, including those with PTSD, hold negative beliefs about people with mental illness. Many people perceive those with mental illness as being mad, weak, and useless, and that they can't take care of themselves. This social exclusion discourages many PTSD sufferers from seeking treatment due to their fear of stigma. Further, soldiers with PTSD avoid seeking treatment and avoid engaging in society because they fear engaging in discussion may elicit memories of combat trauma. So far, we have seen that active military personnel are at a greater risk of developing PTSD than the general population. But what can we do to minimize the burden of PTSD in your community? Is it possible to prevent PTSD? What would prevention look like for you? In general, PTSD prevention occurs in 3 phases: primary or universal interventions, which target all military personnel pre-deployment; secondary or selective interventions, which target high-risk military personnel after exposure to combat-related trauma; and finally, tertiary or indicated interventions, which target individuals already suffering from PTSD symptoms and aim to reduce adverse outcomes of the disease. Today, we will be focusing on universal or primary treatments. Firstly, primary preventions aim to decrease the burden of PTSD before exposure to combat and deployment-related stressors. Secondly, primary preventions require no pre-screening as they are applied to the entire population. And finally, primary preventions do not select specific high-risk individuals, thereby reducing the stigma surrounded by seeking help for PTSD. This is particularly important to address the social determinant of social exclusion. We hope our focus on primary prevention will provide an opportunity to address PTSD without fear of stigmatization. Primary treatments strive to develop mental resilience in military personnel, as resilience has been found to be inversely correlated to PTSD. As we have discussed, during combat, military personnel are exposed to mentally and emotionally demanding working conditions. To overcome these challenges, military personnel must be equipped with mental resilience. As such, to address the social determinant of working conditions, we are focused on programs to strengthen mental resilience. To reduce the prevalence of PTSD among active military personnel by enhancing mental resilience, we suggest the implementation of the Ptsd program. Ptsd stands for Pre-Deployment Stress Inoculation Training. This program involves 3 phases. The first phase, education, educates pre-deployment military personnel about combat stress control. The second phase, skill introduction, introduces the military personnel to skills that aim to provide coping mechanisms in stressful situations. These skills focus on breathing exercises paired with biofeedback technology. Finally, in phase 3, skill testing, military personnel are subjected to multimedia stressor environments. These environments replicate a combat-like stress and forces the military personnel to utilize the breathing exercises taught in phase 2. Together, the 3 phases aim to build resilience within military personnel and provide military personnel with stress management skills to reduce hyperarousal. But does this program work? Preliminary research conducted by Harani et al. Found that those enrolled in the Ptsd program were 7 times less likely to develop PTSD than those in the present stress reduction program. These results show promise for this new program. Beyond preliminary results in active military personnel, similar resilience-based training programs have been applied to reduce occupational-related stress in first responders. For example, Arnez et al. And Anderson et al. Have found that resilience-based training programs focused on stress management skill education involving breathing exercises followed by imaginary-based practice situations resulted in reduced occupational-related stress in first responders. Further, Arnez et al. Reported that these interventions resulted in long-term stress reduction based on biological and self-reported data. Although the program's efficacy to reduce PTSD has not been directly evaluated, due to evidence of long-term stress reduction, Anderson et al. Suggests that resilience-based training programs may be effective in reducing PTSD among this population. In summary, you learned with us today about biomedical pathways associated with the onset of PTSD, as well as why your community is at a greater risk of developing this condition. Further, you learned how to prevent PTSD prior to deployment in order to lessen the possible effects this condition may have on your lives.